My name is Marcus, I'm 35, and I will never forget the night my parents told me I wasn't welcome at the family retreat. For 15 summers, that retreat had been my compass, the one place where no matter what happened in my life, I belonged. I was there when my grandparents were still alive, when my siblings got married, when new babies were introduced to the clan. I was there even the summer my own marriage collapsed. And then, in a single phone call, I was told there wasn't enough space for me. I remember standing in my kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator suddenly deafening. My mom's voice dripped through the speaker sugary sweet in that way she always used when she was about to hurt me. You understand, right? Couples and children have to come first. You're single, Marcus. It just makes sense. I froze. The pasta I'd been stirring began to burn, the smell of scorched garlic filling the room. Single. That was the word they chose to erase me with. As if my worth as a son, as a brother, as an uncle could be reduced to the fact that my marriage had ended and I hadn't rebuilt a picture-perfect household fast enough. Do you know that feeling when the ground shifts beneath you? When suddenly the family you've bled for, worked for, stood up for, looks at you and sees a complication. That's what it felt like. A verdict. Not enough. Not chosen. Not even considered. I wanted to shout. I planned half those retreats. I negotiated the group rates, I built the activities schedule, I stuffed those stupid welcome baskets with my own money. But the words stuck in my throat. What good would it do to remind them of my devotion when they had already decided I was expendable? Instead, silence took over. I let my mother finish her rehearsed script, hung up, and stood staring at the wall. The truth cut deeper than anger ever could. They had made room for 66 people, and not for me. There was space, it just wasn't for me. That night I didn't sleep. I replayed every memory like a cruel highlight reel. The bonfires where I roasted marshmallows for my nieces, the mornings when I led hikes for the cousins, the years I swallowed my own pain so my siblings could have their perfect photos. And now I wasn't worth a bed, not even a couch, not even an air mattress on the floor. Here's the thing about betrayal when it comes from family, it doesn't just hurt in the present, it rewrites the past. Suddenly every smile, every thank you, every arm around my shoulder feels counterfeit. You begin to wonder if you ever truly belonged, or if you were always just tolerated until you no longer fit their image. And deep inside, under the heartbreak, a new emotion stirred clarity. This wasn't about logistics. It wasn't about rooms. It was about control, about image, about punishing me for breaking their illusion of a flawless family. I had gotten divorced, lost a job, fallen behind the script, and for that I was erased. But here's what my parents didn't see coming. Being erased can set you free. If there was no space for me at their table, then I would build a new table. If they chose to define me by absence, I would define myself by presence, louder, brighter, and unashamed. I remember looking into the mirror at dawn, bloodshot eyes staring back, whispering to my own reflection, "They didn't make room for you, so you're going to make your own." That moment, raw, trembling, furious, was the beginning of everything that followed. Before I continue, let me ask you something straight. Have you ever been left out by the very people who were supposed to love you unconditionally? Think about that. Sting the silence at the table where your chair should have been the empty spot in the family photo, where your smile used to fit. If you felt that, then you understand a piece of what I went through. And if this story resonates already, don't just sit quietly, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, share your own moment of being excluded, and hit subscribe so you won't miss the rest of this journey. Because trust me, it gets darker and then it gets powerful. Now let me pull you back into the story. That night after my mother's phone call, the words, "not enough space," kept echoing in my head. It wasn't just a logistical excuse, it was a verdict. It meant I wasn't seen as vital, as irreplaceable. They could swap me out like a spare part. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, and in that long stretch of silence I kept asking myself, why me? Out of all the siblings, all the cousins, why was I the one cut? And then it clicked, because I was the complication. The divorced one. The son who lost his job when the company downsized. The brother who no longer carried the shiny label of success. My family had built their identity on image, perfect children, perfect marriages, perfect careers. And I had broken the picture. When my marriage imploded after 3 years of betrayal, they didn't rally around me. They rallied around him, my ex. He was still invited to birthdays, to dinners, and now to the retreat. Meanwhile, I was erased like a stain on the photograph. Let me be clear, this wasn't just about a bed at a cabin. They made room for extended family, for friends of friends, for people who hadn't even been part of the tradition for more than a year. But not me. They had space for 66, but not for 67. I thought back to all the retreats I'd poured myself into. The summers I coordinated the bookings, the hikes, the s'mores nights. I had been the invisible scaffolding holding the tradition together, and now they tore me down without a thought. That betrayal started eating at me like acid. I tried calling my brother Tyler. He dodged the conversation. My sister Jessica was too busy. Zach mumbled something about respecting Mom and Dad's decision. Only my youngest sister Heather sounded conflicted, but she was too afraid to stand up to them. The isolation cut deeper than the rejection itself. It wasn't just my parents shutting the door. It was the silence of my siblings, their cowardly compliance, that drove the knife in further. Family, the people who should have defended me, chose convenience over loyalty. But here's the paradox: in that silence, a seed of defiance began to grow. If I was truly on the outside now, then I had nothing left to lose. And when you have nothing left to lose, you start imagining what it would feel like to take control of the story again. Still, I wasn't there yet. In this part of the journey, I was raw, bleeding from the rejection, dizzy with disbelief. I scrolled through Instagram, seeing their posts about the biggest family gathering yet, their matching outfits, their hashtags about togetherness. Every picture screamed the same thing: we're perfect, and you don't belong. But here's what I want you to hear. Exclusion doesn't just leave you empty, it forces you to see the truth. The truth about who values you and who values the image of you. And once you see that, you can never go back to pretending. So when I tell you the next part of this story, know that it didn't come from a place of revenge. It came from a place of survival. They tried to erase me, but instead they gave me the clarity to rewrite everything. And that's where the story really begins to shift. Every family has its glossy picture, right? The one that looks perfect on a Christmas card, all smiles and matching sweaters. For the Watsons, my family, that picture wasn't just a snapshot, it was a brand. They lived for appearances. From the outside, we looked like the kind of family people envied. My father, a respected attorney, my mother, the perfect hostess. My siblings, 3 of them, lined up like polished trophies. Tyler, the investment banker, Jessica, the school principal, Zach, the up-and-coming tech entrepreneur. And then me, Marcus, the one who used to fit until life chipped away at my shine. I think back to those retreats, the ones before I was cut out. Everything was orchestrated, the matching outfits on the first night for group photos by the lake, the speeches Grandpa used to give about family unity, the carefully planned meals with place cards. Even though we were just eating barbecue, it wasn't enough for us to be together, we had to look together. It wasn't always like this. When I was a kid, the retreats were messy and beautiful. We played capture the flag in the woods, we told ghost stories, we fought over Monopoly. Nobody cared if we were in mismatched pajamas. But somewhere along the line, after money and careers started stacking up, image replaced intimacy. I saw it happening. At first I thought I was imagining things, but slowly the focus shifted from connection to curation. Instagram posts took precedence over actual conversations. Dinners turned into press conferences where each sibling rattled off achievements waiting for applause. And if you didn't have an achievement worth mentioning, you faded into the background. That was my role after the divorce. Background. I remember one retreat 2 years ago when Jessica announced her promotion to principal. Everyone cheered. Dad raised a glass. Then I tried to talk about the freelance work I was doing, and the conversation died within seconds. No toasts, no recognition. Just a polite nod before they moved on to Zach's new startup funding. I laughed it off at the time, told myself not to care. But deep down I felt it, the quiet downgrading of my value, the subtle demotion from son to spectator. And here's the truth. I think my parents wanted me out of this year's retreat because I didn't fit the brand anymore. Divorce didn't look good on camera. A son without kids didn't add to the big family aesthetic. Struggling financially, definitely not photogenic. That's when it hit me I wasn't excluded by accident. I was excluded because I was a crack in the facade. And if you're trying to sell the world on a perfect picture, cracks have to be erased. I thought about my siblings' compliance too. Tyler, who measured everything in return on investment, wasn't going to jeopardize his own standing by defending me. Jessica had her reputation to protect, And Zach had his startup to pitch at the retreat to potential investors in the family circle. They weren't going to risk their seats at the table for me. And my parents. They weren't just hosts of the retreat anymore, they were curators of an exhibition. And I was the blemish on the canvas. The cruelest part, they smiled through it. They wrapped the knife in sweetness. You understand, right? That was the refrain. A gentle dismissal disguised as logic. But here's what I want you to see: when a family starts treating love as conditional, based on status success image, it stops being family. It becomes a corporation with shareholders. And if you're not profitable, you get cut loose. Realizing that truth made me feel both gutted and strangely free. For the first time, I stopped chasing their approval. Because if love has to be earned through performance, it's not love at all. And I promised myself then I wasn't going to play the background anymore. Not in their picture. Not in my own life. The days leading up to the retreat were some of the loneliest of my life. I wish I could say I brushed it off, that I told myself I didn't need them. But the truth, it cut me down to the bone. Down. Everywhere I turned, reminders mocked me. At the grocery store, I passed a family loading their car for what looked like a road trip, kids buzzing with excitement. At church, a friend asked if I was heading out to the big Watson getaway again. I forced a smile, said something vague, and left early before the sting showed on my face. Nights were the worst. I'd lie in bed replaying the moment over and over, Mom's voice on the phone, casual, almost cheerful. There's just not enough space. Like she was talking about folding chairs at a picnic, not her own son. That phrase wrapped itself around me like barbed wire. I couldn't shake it. You know what's strange grief for something that isn't even tangible? I wasn't grieving a death or an accident. I was grieving my place in a story I thought was mine by birthright. My family had edited me out, and I had to watch the rerun in my head every night, frame by frame. I tried distractions, went for runs until my legs burned, binged shows on Netflix, even tried going out with friends. But nothing filled the silence. When your own family rejects you, the world outside suddenly feels less stable, like the ground beneath you can't be trusted. The worst moment came on the Saturday they left for the retreat. My phone lit up with notifications, Instagram posts, group texts. Tyler posted a picture of his SUV packed with coolers and matching Watson family shirts. Jessica uploaded a reel of her kids singing the family anthem we used to belt out around the campfire. And there I was scrolling, staring a ghost, haunting my own life. I won't lie, I broke down. Sat in my apartment, lights off, phone in hand, tears I didn't even feel running down my face. For the first time, I wondered if maybe they were right. Maybe I didn't deserve a seat anymore. Maybe love really was conditional, and I had failed the conditions. But in that pit of despair, something shifted. It wasn't a lightning bolt, not some grand epiphany, more like a flicker, a whisper. A realization that as much as they hurt me, the deeper wound was me believing them. Believing that their rejection defined my worth, and that whisper grew louder. What if you stop waiting for their invitation? What if you write your own? I didn't know what it meant yet, didn't have a plan, but the thought took root. If they wouldn't give me a place in the retreat, maybe I needed to create a new kind of gathering, a new kind of story. Not about image, not about status, about presence, about people who chose to stay. It didn't erase the loneliness, not yet, but it gave me something new to hold on to. A spark against the dark. Looking back, that was the turning point. Pain didn't disappear, but it began to change shape, from pure despair into the raw material of defiance. Because when you've been erased, you're faced with a choice: disappear quietly, or draw a new line so bold, so undeniable, it can't be ignored. And I knew deep down my story wasn't ending in silence. You'd think pain would make you smaller, that it would shrink you down until you barely existed. But sometimes pain does the opposite. It swells inside you until it has nowhere left to go, and it starts reshaping you. That's what happened to me the week after the retreat. I woke up one morning, stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, and realized I was done waiting. Done being sidelined in my own life. If my family had no room for me, then maybe I needed to carve out a room so wide and undeniable that no one could close the door again. So I pulled out an old notebook, the kind I used to bring on those retreats when I was a kid. Flipping through the pages, I found sketches of campfires, crude maps of hikes we used to take, even a goofy tally of who roasted the most marshmallows. And suddenly it hit me. Those memories didn't belong to them alone. They belonged to me too. I had lived them. I had carried them, and if they could edit me out, then I could write myself back in. That night I drafted the first version of what I now call the gathering. Not a retreat, not some glossy family tradition dressed up for social media, but a space for people like me, people pushed out, left behind, overlooked. A space where belonging wasn't conditional. At first the idea terrified me. Who was I to start something? Who would even show up? The old voice of doubt kept whispering, "You're not enough. You'll embarrass yourself." But louder still was that whisper from before. What if you stop waiting for their invitation? So I started small. I called a friend I hadn't spoken to in years, someone whose own family had fractured after a messy divorce. We met for coffee. I told her my story, the rejection, the loneliness, the spark of an idea. She didn't laugh. She didn't roll her eyes. She just said, I'd show up for that. That was all the validation I needed. From there, I began reaching out one conversation at a time. A coworker who lost both parents young. A neighbor who was estranged from her siblings after an inheritance fight. Even the barista at my local cafe who admitted he hadn't been home for Thanksgiving in a decade. Each time I told them, what if we made our own family? Not blood, not obligation, just presence. And each time the answer was some version of yes. By the end of that week, my scribbled notes had turned into a plan. A rented cabin 2 hours north. A long table that didn't care how many chairs we had to squeeze in. A fire pit not for tradition but for new stories. For the first time in weeks, my chest didn't feel so heavy. I wasn't just reacting to their rejection anymore. I was building something beyond it. And here's where I want to pause and ask you something, because maybe you've been there too. Maybe you felt the sting of being told you're not enough, of being excluded from a table you thought was yours. What would it look like if you stopped waiting for their invitation and wrote your own instead? Drop your thoughts below. I read every comment, and I'd love to know how you would redraw the line. Maybe you'll find your spark in the telling the same way I did. Because sometimes healing doesn't begin with being welcomed back. Sometimes it begins with opening a new door altogether, and I was ready to swing mine wide open. The week before the gathering felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. Excitement and terror tangled in my chest so tightly I couldn't tell one from the other. I'd booked the cabin, sent the invites, and now there was no turning back. But the question kept gnawing at me. Would anyone actually come? I spent hours getting the place ready. I bought mismatched mugs from thrift stores, stacked extra blankets in the corner, and scribbled out name tags not for obligation, but as a reminder, you belong here. The details mattered because they weren't just props, they were symbols. Proof that we didn't need matching sweaters or polished speeches to create something real. Still doubt hovered. I kept picturing myself alone at that long wooden table, candles flickering, food untouched, waiting for people who never arrived. That image haunted me so much that I nearly canceled. Nearly sent out a message saying, sorry, maybe next time. But then I remembered my family's retreat. How carefully curated it all was, how exclusion wore a smile. And I realized something: even if just one person showed up, it would still matter. Because one real connection outweighed 100 staged ones. So I held the line. On the morning of the gathering, I drove up early. The air was crisp, the kind that bites your skin and wakes you up. Pine needles crunched under my boots as I unlocked the cabin. The place smelled like wood and old stone fireplaces, nothing fancy, but it felt alive. I laid out the food, nothing gourmet, just chili simmering in a crock-pot, cornbread and store-bought pie. I told myself, it doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be honest. One by one, they started arriving. First was Sarah, my friend from the coffee shop. She walked in carrying a half-burnt candle and laughed. Figured we could use some light. Then came James, the co-worker who had lost his parents. He brought a deck of cards. A neighbor showed up with a casserole still warm, and slowly the table filled. When we finally sat down, something extraordinary happened. There were no toasts, no speeches, just stories, raw, jagged stories, a divorce that cut too deep, parents who walked away, a son who never came back. We listened not to reply, not to fix, but to witness. And in that space, something broke open. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel erased. I felt rewritten. Halfway through, I looked around at the mismatched chairs, the clumsy candlelight, the laughter bubbling up between tears, and I realized this was family too. Not blood, Not obligation, just presence. It was messy, it was unscripted, and it was perfect. And maybe that's where the healing really began. Not in being welcomed back to the old table, but in building a new one altogether. But I want to ask you something because maybe you're listening to this thinking, that sounds impossible. That could never be me. What if it could? What if the family you long for isn't behind you, but waiting ahead in people you haven't met yet? Tell me, have you ever built your own kind of family or dreamed of it? I'd love to hear your story. Drop it in the comments because you never know, your story might be the spark someone else needs. That night, as we cleared the table and piled dishes in the sink, I felt lighter. Not because my pain had vanished, but because it had been shared, divided among us, and somehow that made it easier to carry. I went to bed in that drafty cabin with a simple truth echoing in my chest. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is to stop chasing a closed door and start building a new one. And I knew this was just the beginning. The morning after the gathering, I woke up to sunlight cutting across the cabin floor. For a moment, I lay there listening to the muffled sounds of people stirring pots, clinking footsteps creaking against old wood, and it struck me I wasn't alone. That realization carried more weight than I could explain. For weeks, I'd been drowning in the silence of rejection, in the echo of being told there was no space for me. But here, surrounded by people who had once felt just as discarded, the silence had been replaced with something softer, the low hum of belonging. We lingered over breakfast pancakes from a mix burnt at the edges, bacon too crisp, coffee so strong it nearly took the enamel off your teeth. It didn't matter. What mattered were the conversations. Sarah spoke about the years she spent trying to earn back a seat at her parents' table before realizing they'd nailed the door shut. James admitted he hadn't told anyone how much he still mourned his mother, and for the first time someone actually listened. As the plates emptied, something shifted. This wasn't just about sharing pain anymore. It was about possibility. About rewriting the rules of what family could mean. I sat there watching the laughter ripple across the table and realized I couldn't let this be a one-time thing. One gathering wasn't enough. We needed more. We deserved more. So I said it out loud. What if this wasn't the end? What if this was the beginning of something bigger? The room went quiet. Then slowly heads started to nod. Sarah leaned forward and said, "You mean, like a project, a community?" The idea landed like a spark in dry grass. Within minutes, the air was alive with plans. A mailing list, a calendar, monthly dinners, weekend hikes. Someone even suggested we create a website so people outside our circle could join. I felt my pulse race. Just days earlier, I'd been bracing myself for an empty table. Now I was staring at the possibility of a movement. But with that excitement came a shadow. Because the bigger this grew, the more visible it would become. And the more visible it became, the harder it would be to keep it hidden from the people I least wanted to notice, my family. Still, I couldn't shake the conviction that this mattered too much to bury. Too many people needed a place to belong. Too many people were carrying the same wounds I had carried. As we packed up the cabin, loading leftovers into coolers and sweeping pine needles out the door, I felt a strange mix of fear and resolve. Fear of being seen, of being judged, of stirring up another round of rejection. But resolve, too, the kind that roots itself deep when you know you're standing in truth. Driving home, I replayed the weekend in my mind. The laughter, the tears, the way pain had been alchemized into connection. And I knew this was bigger than me. Because here's the thing, when you create space for yourself, you discover it was never just for you. It's for everyone who's been told they don't belong. And maybe you've felt that too. Maybe you've carried that same ache of being on the outside looking in. What if the healing you're waiting for isn't about being invited back, but about creating the invitation yourself? Think about it, and while you're here, share your thoughts. Because every story whispered out loud has the power to become someone else's lifeline. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I'd made a decision. The gathering wouldn't just be a memory, it would be a promise. A seed planted in soil I once thought too barren to grow anything. And I was ready to see what might bloom. It started quietly, an email chain, a group chat, a shared calendar, but within weeks, the gathering became something more than I ever imagined. What began as a single night in a drafty cabin grew into a rhythm. Twice a month we met. Sometimes in living rooms, sometimes in borrowed community halls, sometimes under open skies with fire pits crackling and guitars being passed around like sacred relics. The rules were simple: come as you are, speak if you want, listen if you need, and always bring an open chair. There was no hierarchy, no one person at the head of the table, just presence, just us. People started inviting friends, coworkers, even strangers they'd met at grocery store lines. And every time I felt the same twinge of disbelief. They showed up. But the truth was, people were starving for connection for a place where they weren't measured against impossible standards for a family that wasn't tethered to blood, but to choice. And the stories that spilled out, they cracked something open in all of us. A veteran who hadn't spoken about the war in years, a teenager who confessed she was terrified of going home, a widowed mother who admitted she felt invisible. Each voice added a new thread, weaving something sturdier than I could have hoped. It didn't take long before word spread. A local reporter showed up one evening after hearing about our gatherings from a friend. He didn't come with a camera, just a notebook. He sat, listened, cried with us. A week later, an article appeared in the city paper, "When family fails, they build their own." I should have felt proud. Instead, I froze. Because with visibility came risk, and risk meant exposure. My family read that paper. They lived in the same city. What if they saw? What if they recognized me? And of course they did. The phone rang late one night. My father's voice sharp, slicing through the static. "What the hell is this nonsense you're parading in the papers? Some pity party for people too weak to fix their own lives." My chest burned. I wanted to fight back, to shout that he was wrong, that weakness wasn't what I saw at our table. It was strength, raw and unpolished. But I bit my tongue. Not because I agreed, but because I realized something: I didn't owe him an explanation. That silence, though, only made him angrier. He spat words about shame, about betrayal, about how I was dragging the family's name through the mud. And then he hung up. For a moment I sat there staring at the phone like it might bite me. Part of me wanted to crumble, to retreat, to shut it all down before it got worse. But another part of me, stronger, steadier, whispered, "No, not this time." Because here's what I knew in my bones: you cannot be erased if you write yourself back into existence. So I doubled down. We started a newsletter, launched a small website, even registered the name, The Gathering Project. It wasn't about rebellion. It was about survival, and about offering survival to others who still believed they were alone. And maybe that's something you need to hear right now. Maybe you've been told over and over that your story isn't valid, that your voice doesn't count, that you're nothing, without the approval of those who shut the door on you. But what if that's the biggest lie you've ever been sold? What if your story could be the very spark that lights someone else's way? Think about that. Hold on to it. Because the moment you realize your story matters, their power over you begins to crumble. As for me, the more my father raged, the more determined I became. Because his anger was proof that I had stepped outside the cage he built. And once you've tasted freedom, there's no going back. The gathering was no longer a single night, or even a handful of meetings. It was becoming a movement. And movements, once they begin, have a way of outgrowing even the people who start them. And I was ready to see just how far this one could go. You ever have that moment when you know the ground beneath you is shifting, but you don't know if it's going to swallow you whole or carry you somewhere new? That's where I found myself. The gathering was exploding. What started in that little cabin had become something the city couldn't stop talking about. We were holding events twice a week now. Community halls filled to capacity, people standing along the walls just to be in the room. They weren't there for speeches or ceremonies or leaders. They were there for presence, for the radical idea that being seen, heard, and valued was enough. But with growth came pressure. And pressure has a way of finding the cracks you thought you had sealed. My father's phone calls turned into letters. Letters turned into visits. He showed up at my workplace one afternoon, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "You think you're building something. You're just embarrassing yourself. Embarrassing us." His words were sharp, designed to cut, and they did. For days I walked into each gathering, wondering if he or someone he'd sent would be waiting at the door ready to shame me in front of the very people I was trying to protect. And maybe that fear is what drove me harder, pushed me to dream bigger. Because if they were going to call it rebellion, then I wanted to make it a rebellion worth remembering. We began organizing not just dinners, but workshops, mental health support groups, job networking nights, a food pantry program that served more than 50 families in its first month. What was once a circle of hurt was becoming a circle of action, and that's when the real twist began to take shape. Because you see, the more we built, the more people started asking questions I wasn't sure I had the answers to. What's next? Where is this going? Who's in charge? I wasn't sure how to respond. I hadn't planned this far. All I knew was that people were hungry for belonging and that hunger was spreading faster than I could keep up with. One night after everyone had left and the room was quiet again, I sat staring at the stack of sign-up sheets. Hundreds of names, hundreds of stories. And I realized something chilling. If this continued to grow, it wouldn't just be about us anymore. It would become political, visible, unignorable. And once something becomes unignorable, the world either embraces it or tries to crush it. That thought kept me awake long into the night. What if this whole thing collapsed under its own weight? What if my family's threats weren't just words, but the beginning of something darker? And here's where I want to pull you closer, because this is the moment where the story you're hearing could fracture in two very different directions. One path leads to power, the other to destruction. And the truth, I didn't know which one I was on. So let me ask you, because sometimes it takes an outside voice to see the truth. What would you have done? Would you have slowed down? Kept it small? Kept it safe? Or would you have pushed forward, even knowing the storm that was forming on the horizon? Drop your thoughts below, because trust me, your perspective might just be the mirror someone else needs to see their own path. As for me, I chose not to answer those questions right away. Instead, I leaned into the uncertainty. I let it hang in the air, unspoken, unresolved. Because deep down I sensed something was coming. Something that would either validate everything we'd built or test it in ways I couldn't yet imagine. And when it came, it didn't arrive quietly. It arrived with headlines, with confrontation, with a truth none of us were prepared for. But that's a story I'll only tell if you're willing to stay. The headlines hit like a thunderclap. Grassroots movement, or Cult One paper asked. Another splashed across its front page. Daughter of prominent businessman, defies family builds, alternative community. My name was there, bold and unavoidable. My father's too. Suddenly the story wasn't about healing connection or belonging, it was about scandal, about bloodlines, about betrayal. At first I couldn't breathe. It felt like the walls were closing in, like everything we'd built was about to be stripped away by people who didn't understand. Reporters camped outside my apartment. Camera crews staked out the community hall. Strangers whispered my name like it was an accusation. But then something I didn't expect happened. People from the gathering, people who owed me nothing, started speaking up. They wrote letters to the editor, gave interviews of their own, posted videos online. A veteran said, "This saved my life." A single mother said, "I don't feel invisible anymore." A teenager recorded a shaky clip on her phone. "This is the first place I ever felt like I belonged." And one by one their voices began to drown out the noise. For the first time, the public narrative wasn't controlled by my family or the press. It was controlled by us. Still, the backlash was brutal. My father escalated. He accused me of exploiting vulnerable people, of building a circus of weakness. He sent letters to city officials demanding we be shut down. And at a dinner one night, when I thought maybe he'd calmed down, he looked me in the eye and said, "If you keep this up, you're no daughter of mine." The words sliced deeper than I wanted to admit. I'd known our relationship was broken, but to hear him cut me out completely, it left a scar. For days, I carried that sentence like a weight around my chest. But here's the twist: while my father was trying to erase me, others were trying to lift me higher than I ever dreamed. One evening after another gathering that filled the hall beyond capacity, a woman approached me. Her suit was sharp, her eyes even sharper. She introduced herself as Claire Donovan, a city council member. "I've been following your work," she said, "and frankly, I'm impressed. You've created something people desperately need. But you need structure. You need protection. Because if you don't build it now, someone else will build it for you, and not in the way you want." I didn't know whether to feel honored or terrified. Here was someone with power offering me legitimacy, but also warning me of what was at stake. That night I lay awake, turning her words over and over. Structure, protection, legitimacy. Up until now, the gathering had thrived because it was fluid, organic, free of labels. But maybe Claire was right. Maybe if we didn't define ourselves, others would define us, and not kindly. The thought shook me, because building structure meant stepping into a role I never asked for: leadership. And leadership meant visibility, responsibility, exposure. And yet, as I pictured the faces of the people who showed up week after week, the veteran, the teenager, the mother, I realized something. This wasn't about me anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. So I made a decision, quietly, resolutely. I would take Claire's advice. I would build the scaffolding that would keep us standing, even if it meant carrying the weight of leadership, even if it meant drawing the fire directly onto myself. Because sometimes the very thing you fear most is the only thing that will keep what you love alive. And I had no idea then just how much fire was coming. When you decide to step into the light, you don't get to choose how people see you. That's the lesson I learned the moment I agreed to meet with Claire Donovan again. We sat in a quiet corner of a downtown cafe, her leather notebook already open, a pen poised, as if she'd been planning this meeting for weeks. You need bylaws. You need a board. You need to incorporate, she said without preamble. Otherwise, the gathering will collapse, or worse, it'll be stolen. Her words carried weight. I'd seen enough stories of movements hijacked, of good intentions twisted by power. Still, the thought of legal paperwork, formal titles, and structures made my stomach knot. I wasn't a politician. I wasn't an organizer. I was just someone who had been abandoned and decided nobody else should feel that alone. But when I walked back into the community hall later that evening, the sight stopped me cold. The room was overflowing. People packed shoulder to shoulder, spilling out into the street. Volunteers handed out chairs, poured coffee, organized name tags. It looked less like a small gathering and more like a movement. And suddenly, Claire's words didn't feel like bureaucracy. They felt like survival. So we did it. We filed the paperwork. We created a nonprofit. We chose a name, one that honored where we came from, but pointed toward where we were going. The gathering was no longer just a circle, it was an institution. At first it felt exhilarating. Doors opened. We gained access to grants, venues, platforms. Suddenly people who once ignored us were asking to partner. Local news stations wanted to profile us. Volunteers multiplied. Donations flowed. But growth is never simple. The moment you introduce structure, you introduce politics. People who once came just to belong now wanted influence, power, control. Meetings turned tense. Debates stretched long into the night. Friendships strained under the weight of decisions that couldn't please everyone. And then there was my father. The moment he caught wind of the incorporation, he called it a publicity stunt. You're not a leader, he spat during one of his rare phone calls. You're a fraud, in over her head. I wish I could say his words rolled off me, but they didn't. Every new challenge, every tough vote, every complaint whispered behind my back echoed with his voice. Fraud, fraud, fraud. And yet every time I stood in front of the group, every time I saw those eyes, hopeful, desperate, searching, I knew I couldn't back down. Because they weren't looking for perfection. They were looking for someone who wouldn't abandon them. Still the cracks widened. I noticed people forming factions, aligning themselves with this program or that project. And late at night when the room was finally empty, I'd ask myself, had I done the very thing I feared most? Had I built a family destined to fracture like my own? One evening I walked the length of the hall after everyone had gone home. The chairs were stacked neatly, the coffee cups cleared away. But the silence was deafening. For the first time I wondered if I'd started something I couldn't finish. And then, as if the universe knew, I was doubting, an email landed in my inbox. A message from a national foundation. They had heard about us. They wanted to fly me out, hear our story firsthand, and consider us for a grant that could change everything. It was the kind of opportunity that could secure our future or expose our deepest fractures to the world. I closed my laptop and sat in the dark, heart pounding. This was it. The moment that could define whether the gathering became a force for change or collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. And I couldn't shake the haunting question, what if my father was right? What if I wasn't ready for this? The flight to Washington felt heavier than any trip I'd ever taken, not because of the miles, but because of the weight strapped to my chest. When I boarded that plane, I wasn't just a woman running a local circle anymore. I was representing hundreds of voices that had tethered their hope to me. If I stumbled, they stumbled with me. The Foundation's headquarters was intimidating in its own right. Glass walls that seemed to stretch to the sky, polished marble floors, reflecting every doubt I carried. I remember walking past their reception desk, clutching the folder that held our mission statement, financial breakdowns, and testimonials. My hands shook so badly I thought I'd drop it. The panel was waiting in a conference room that felt more like a courtroom. 5 faces neutral and unreadable studied me as I took my seat. Claire had warned me this would happen. They want to see if you can hold your ground, she'd said. Because if you can't convince them, you'll never survive the scrutiny that comes next. So I started. I told them about the veteran who said the gathering saved his life. About the teenager who whispered that it was the first place she felt she belonged. About the single mother who told us she no longer cried herself to sleep. My voice trembled at first, but as I spoke, something shifted. The stories weren't mine alone, they belonged to the people who had trusted me. And for their sake, I steadied. One of the panelists, a gray-haired man with sharp glasses, leaned forward. You talk about community, but movements like this, they collapse under scale. What happens when growth destroys intimacy, when politics devours the purity of your mission? The question cut deep because it wasn't hypothetical, it was already happening. But instead of dodging, I answered honestly. That risk is real, I said. But abandonment is worse. If intimacy shrinks as we grow, then we adapt. But if we do nothing, people go back to the silence that nearly killed them. I'd rather fight for connection, even imperfect connection, than surrender to isolation. For a moment, silence. Then the woman at the end of the table smiled. And I knew we had a chance. Later, as I left the building, Claire called me. How did it go? She asked. I told her everything, the question, the doubt, the answer I gave without rehearsing. She was quiet, then said, That's leadership. Not pretending you have all the answers, showing that you'll stand in the fire anyway. But even as she praised me, I couldn't shake the unease. Because while I was in Washington, messages had been flooding my phone. At home, fractures inside the gathering were widening. One program director accused another of hoarding resources. A volunteer stormed out mid-meeting. And whispers started again that maybe I was too distracted, too focused on the spotlight, too far removed from the community we built. For the first time, success felt as dangerous as failure. Winning this grant could secure our future, but it could also shine a spotlight on cracks that would only deepen under pressure. That night, in my hotel room, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. Was I building a home, or was I building a stage that would collapse beneath all of us? And here's where I'll let you in on something the answer didn't come in Washington. It came back home when I walked into a meeting expecting gratitude and found confrontation instead. Because when growth threatens unity, the true test isn't winning money or recognition, it's surviving betrayal from the inside. And what happened next would make me question everything I thought I knew about loyalty. When I returned home, the welcome wasn't applause, it was fire. The moment I stepped into the community hall, I could feel the air thick with tension. Conversations hushed, eyes darted. And then one of the program leads, Aaron, stood up and said the words that pierced deeper than any stranger's criticism ever could. You left us drowning while you chased the spotlight. I froze. This was the same man who had volunteered every weekend, who'd driven across town in snowstorms just to set up chairs. His voice shook with anger. While you were in D.C., people here were at each other's throats. We had no mediator, no leader, and you weren't here to see it. Others nodded. Some crossed their arms. And suddenly the very community I had fought to build looked like a jury ready to deliver a verdict. I tried to explain the foundation, the opportunity, the need for resources if we were going to survive long term. But my words felt hollow against their frustration. That night I walked home through the rain, soaked not by water but by the weight of betrayal. My father's voice echoed again in my head. You're not a leader, you're a fraud. The truth was, he wasn't entirely wrong. I had underestimated how fragile trust can be. One absence, one misstep, and the bond we had built began to fray. Days turned into weeks, and the fractures deepened. Some members started breaking off into smaller groups. Others whispered that maybe someone else should lead. I had never felt more alone, ironically, in the very movement created to fight loneliness. One evening I received a message that stopped me cold. A volunteer I deeply trusted had been secretly recording meetings and sharing clips online. Snippets without context, twisted to look like proof of dysfunction. And people outside, people who never stepped foot inside the gathering, were eating it up. It hit me, betrayal doesn't always come from outside forces. Sometimes it comes from those who sit closest to you, the ones who know where the cracks already are. That night, I nearly drafted a resignation letter. My cursor blinked on the empty page, daring me to quit. I imagined walking away, letting someone else carry the burden, letting my father's prophecy come true. But then I thought of the veteran, who said the gathering saved his life. of the teenager who whispered she'd finally found belonging, of the mother who no longer cried herself to sleep. Their faces pulled me back from the brink. I closed the laptop and whispered aloud to the empty room, "No, not like this." The next day, I returned to the hall not to defend myself, but to tell the truth. I admitted I had made mistakes. I admitted I had underestimated the toll of growth. And then I asked the hardest question: if you don't trust me anymore, say it now. I'll step aside. But if you still believe in what we're building, then we fight together. Because this movement is bigger than me. Bigger than any of us. The silence that followed felt eternal. And then slowly, one by one, hands lifted. Not all of them, but enough. Enough to remind me that fractured doesn't mean broken. Still, I knew the storm wasn't over. The videos were spreading, the whispers were growing. And somewhere out there, people were watching, waiting for us to collapse. And that's when I realized the real test wasn't surviving abandonment from family. It was surviving betrayal from within the family I had chosen. And what happened next would take betrayal to a level I never imagined. But before I tell you that part, let me ask you, have you ever been betrayed not by a stranger, but by someone you trusted with your whole heart? If you have, you'll understand what came next. If you haven't, brace yourself. Because the next twist, it still shakes me to this day. I thought the worst had passed, that with enough honesty and enough courage, the fractures inside the gathering could mend. But what I didn't realize was that the deepest wound was still waiting to be cut, and it came from someone I trusted most. Her name was Rachel. She had been with me from the very beginning. She was the one who stayed late cleaning up after our first meetings, the one who called me when I doubted myself, the one who always said we're in this together. So when whispers started that Rachel had been meeting privately with donors without me, I refused to believe them. She was my right hand, my friend, my family. But then I saw it. An email chain forwarded to me by accident. Lines of text where Rachel described herself as the true architect of the gathering, promising stability, promising she could rescue the mission from emotional leadership. That phrase, emotional leadership, burned me. She meant me. I confronted her heart-pounding voice, shaking. And she didn't even deny it. She just stared at me and said, "You care too much about stories about feelings. That won't survive growth. People like you build sparks. People like me build institutions." It was a knife slipped between my ribs because on some level she was right. I did lead with emotion. That was my strength and also my weakness. But betrayal isn't just about truth, it's about trust, and hers was gone. When word spread, it split the group like an earthquake. Some sided with me, insisting that passion was the heartbeat of our work. Others gravitated toward Rachel's promise of order and control. Meetings turned into battlegrounds. Volunteers quit. And the community we had built on unity was devouring itself from the inside. I wanted to scream. I wanted to collapse. I wanted to undo every step that had led us here. But instead, I remembered something Claire had told me back in Washington. Leadership isn't about avoiding fire. It's about standing in it without burning away. So I stood. I told the group the truth that the gathering was born from people abandoned, silenced, and overlooked. That if we traded authenticity for control, we'd become the very thing we were created to resist. I didn't shout. I didn't beg. I just laid it out raw and unpolished. Some people walked out anyway, Rachel among them, and it broke me in ways I still can't fully describe. Watching her leave was like watching a piece of my own body torn away. But here's the twist I didn't see coming. Her departure didn't kill us. It forced us to decide who we really were. Those who stayed weren't the largest crowd, but they were the truest. And in their eyes, I saw not just loyalty, but defiance. That night, as I locked the doors to the hall, I whispered to myself, maybe loss isn't the end. Maybe it's the fire that hardens what survives. And that's what this betrayal taught me. That chosen family can fracture. That people you love can walk away. But what remains, what endures after the breaking, that's the foundation no storm can destroy. Still, it came at a cost. Relationships shattered, trust mangled. And in the quiet aftermath, I couldn't help but ask myself, was survival enough? Or had betrayal carved away something I would never get back? And the answer to that question didn't come immediately. It came in a moment I never expected, one that forced me to reckon not just with the betrayal of others, but with the ways I had betrayed myself. They say betrayal hardens you, but I think it does something stranger. It hollows you out, then dares you to decide what to refill yourself with. After Rachel left, I felt that hollow. Our numbers had thinned. The media picked up on the division, spinning headlines about a movement collapsing under its own weight. And sometimes late at night, I caught myself wondering if maybe they were right. Maybe this was the slow death my father had predicted all along. But then something unexpected happened. The people who remained the veterans, the teens, the single mothers, the outcasts began stepping into spaces I had once tried to fill alone. Meetings no longer revolved around my words. They became circles where everyone's voice mattered. And in that shared leadership, something sturdier emerged, a community that wasn't just built by me, but by all of us together. One night, as I watched a mother who had once been too shy to speak now lead a discussion about grief, I realized the truth. Maybe Rachel's betrayal didn't destroy us. Maybe it set us free from me. And in that realization, I felt something I hadn't in months: peace. But peace doesn't erase scars. It doesn't erase the images of people walking out or the sound of Rachel's voice when she said emotional leadership. Those wounds remain. What changed was my choice of what to do with them. Instead of seeing them as proof of failure, I began to see them as proof of survival. So here's what I want to leave you with. Family isn't defined by blood or even by promises whispered in trust. Family is defined by those who stay even when staying costs them something. That's the heartbeat of the gathering today. Smaller than it once was, perhaps, but truer, stronger, real. And if you've made it this far into my story, maybe you know why I'm sharing it. Because maybe you've been betrayed. Maybe you've been abandoned. Maybe you've stared at the hollow inside you and wondered what to fill it with. If that's you, then hear me, you are not alone, and you don't have to rebuild by yourself. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing to this channel, because we tell stories like this, not just to entertain, but to remind you that your scars don't disqualify you. They testify to your strength. And if you want to go deeper, check out the next video I've linked. It dives into how one woman rebuilt her life after her entire family turned on her. I think you'll see the same lesson echoed there. Because at the end of the day, the lesson is this: betrayal may hollow you out, but you get to decide what fills the empty space. And in that choice lies freedom. Looking back now, I don't see a movement defined by its fractures. I see a family defined by what endured after the breaking. The storm did not pass us by, it ripped through, tore away pieces, and left us standing in the ruins. But those who remained didn't just stand. They planted, they built, they sang. When I walk into the hall today, I no longer hear the silence of suspicion. I hear laughter. I hear voices overlapping in debate and in joy. I see hands reaching to help set up chairs to carry burdens to embrace. And though sometimes the shadow of betrayal still lingers, it doesn't own the room anymore. Instead, the room belongs to those who stayed, to those who dared to believe that even in the aftermath of loss, something worth holding on to could still grow. That's the part my father never understood. Leadership isn't about being unshakable. It's about being broken and still choosing to stand. It's about standing in the fire and refusing to burn away. So if you carry scars, if you've known the sting of betrayal, let them remind you not of what you lost, but of what you built after. Because survival is not the end of the story, it is the beginning.